This was the reason that I signed up for this conference, was to come to this panel to sit where you are and to listen to what these panelists would say, to tell me how to measure the effectiveness of my Veterans Treatment Court. So I'm looking forward to hearing it as well. I started with the Veterans Treatment Court in 2012. We gathered a group of people, one person from each of the various agencies that's involved, from the VA, from the Vet Center, from the Private Defender Program, from the DA, from probation, from behavioral health. And we met at lunchtime every 2 weeks for about a year, putting together our program. And it's been one of the most rewarding things that I have done on the bench, because to see the changes in people, in these vets, from start to finish, it's just so heartening. I don't deal in data very well, but I think I deal in people pretty well. And to have guys go, as we do this month, from living in the creek for a decade to coming out and living in a home and responding to me the last time he was in court by saying that everything was fantastic and he's going to be graduating in a couple of weeks. That to me is how I measure the effectiveness of my court. But the numbers, not so much. So I'm interested to hear what the panelists have to say. I come to Veterans Treatment Court from an interest in the military services. As you heard, I was in the Army Reserve for 17 years. My son is an Air Force Academy graduate and just finished in Korea, is now coming back here. I have another son who did a tour in Iraq and Afghanistan with the National Guard. And I was Army. My father flew for the Navy in World War II, and my wife's father was a career Navy gentleman. So I come by it naturally, my interest in it. But to see these guys and gals come back from overseas and have the TBI and have the PTSD and the controlled substance issues, it is such an honor to be able to help them. So with that, I hope you'll join me in listening to our panelists, and hopefully they'll give us some insight into measuring the effectiveness of Veterans Treatment Courts. Let me start by introducing Major General Clyde Butch Tate, U.S. Army retired. He and I have something in common. We were both majors in the Judge Advocate. He was promoted 4 more times than I was. But he is a senior fellow for Veteran and Legal Affairs at Justice for Vets. Major General Tate brings to the position over 30 years of experience in the U.S. Army, where he most recently served as the 19th Deputy Judge Advocate General, one of the top 2 military attorneys in the Army. His decorations include 5 awards of the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star Medal, the U.S. Army Parachutist Badge, and numerous foreign airborne badges. General Tate.
Judge, thank you very much. Let me start just by offering some thanks, and I know my fellow panelists will do the same, but thanks to John Hamilton for the energy that you and your team put together in bringing this event about. Thanks to Christina for the patience and doing really all the logistics that it took to get us here. And of course, thanks to all of you for your attendance today and your energy and your interest. I'm honored to be part of this conversation. Coming from DC, I'm actually honored to be part of anything that works. And it's refreshing to be around a group of people, not just dedicated to the cause, but willing to put the energy and the efforts into delivering on the cause. Perhaps the most important thing I'll say to you today is don't forget that tomorrow is Mother's Day. I provide care to my parents. As I told my mom that I was going out to Stanford Law School, some days she's connected to what's going on and some days not, but she looked at me and she said, well, better late than never. So you just don't know what they're paying attention to and grasping and whatnot. But each time that I gather with groups like this to find solutions, I'm reminded of a saying that I suspect all of us wish we would have thought of, and that's from Ken Fisher, of the famed Fisher House Foundation that's done so much to our military families and caregivers, who said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, it's kind of one thing to say thank you for your service, but wouldn't it be nice if we did something more than that, if we provided a tangible thanks to our men and women in uniform and their families and caregivers to say thanks, and then we should have among all of us a resolution to not just say something, but to do something. That's exactly what all of you and all of us are doing with our Veterans Treatment Court programs. We're not just waving the flag, we're not just saying thanks and shaking a hand, we really are doing something. So when the days get long, and for my VGO friends, when you just think that there's just never going to be a solution, just try to remember that. We're doing something, we're not just talking about something. So my goal today is to add to the conversation and I hope provide you some observations and information that you can put to daily use. Now, I've never been burdened by an extensive amount of substantive knowledge, but I really always saw fit to surround myself with those who do. Individuals like my panelists today, with the judge, with Doc Holliday, Dr. Holliday. With a lousy name like Clyde, I gotta admire someone that has a name with a ring to it. Judge Stratton, who is truly got a legacy of amazing accomplishments and service. My Army colleague, Judge Jack Gransert. So the bottom line is Professor Evan Simone, another example of that sort of person. Now, formerly Major Simone. Evan, I know you're in the room now, Professor, who brings such intellectual energy to these endeavors. So probably for many of you, what I'm about to say is really not going to change your life, but I really hope that what it does do is help you change the life of others around you. So here's I think probably 5 quick things I'll share with you, some of which involve the importance of performance measures. Others are just observations I've made that I hope you'll find important to your work. First of all, just please remember that we as Veterans Treatment Courts are part of a required holistic solution to the challenges facing our men and women who have served. There's no single problem. If you think there is, there's not. No one course of action is going to solve their issues. And so as we think about performance measures, we have to be vigilant in identifying systems and performance measures to get to what I describe as our connected concerns. Connected concerns like, it's not just recidivism, it's not just crime rate, those are all indicia of success, but it's what about the other elements here? What about employment? What about housing issues? What about family reunification issues? What about recovery? Let's not just measure whether our courts are working, but let's measure all those connected concerns. So as you think about, are we delivering on what needs to be delivered on? Don't just stop at your courtroom. I think the judge in the keynote comments so clearly and eloquently, far better than I, raised that observation to you. But we have to find measures of success. Number one, it helps us mitigate risk, right? If we identify something falling short, that's a risk that we've got to figure out how we're going to mitigate it. We can't just say, well, we couldn't get at that, but we'll move on to something else. So whatever factors you identify to help you measure that, know that you're doing so to help identify and mitigate risk. A couple of great products out there that will help you think about effective performance measures for your court. A recently released study by the GAO on Veterans Justice Outreach Specialists just came out in April, like last month, right? So I had to think about that for a minute. Jenna and Mike and I talked about this earlier. The GAO has to find something wrong, right, when they're going to report it to Congress. What they found wrong was you don't have enough performance measures in place to know whether you're delivering on expectations or not. Okay, fine, I'll give you that. But right now we're focused on solving problems, and we'll get at our performance measures later. But I commend to all of you that GAO study that indicated, among other things, that just in 2012 to 2015, the workload of our VJOs increased 72%, right? So that's good news, but it's also really bad news, because we haven't increased your staffing or your funding, by 72%. And Judge, you indicate that we couldn't even pay you to come to the conference. Wow, that's remarkable. So, but that's one of those risks we have to mitigate. So how are we going to do that? That's part of the challenge, is how we mitigate that. I commend to you the National Center for State Courts report. It was a Pennsylvania study that came out in May of last year that talked about performance measures and measuring success. As you're deciding how best to do it for your court, please take a look at that report. So that's my first notion to you. Again, not to change your life, it won't, but just to remind all of us that we are part of a holistic solution. There's so much else going on that we need to pay attention to and be a part of. The second observation I would make is the importance, not just of the use of mentors. Where's Ron? I kept hearing Ron's name mentioned. Some courts opt to not use mentors because they feel like, well, we'll get to that, or I don't know how to get to it, but it'll be fine. Well, no, it's not fine. It's absolutely critical, in my opinion. You can disagree, and that's awesome. But in my opinion, you have to have mentors. You have to have a mentor coordinator, by whatever title you want to call it. But importantly, you have to have a trained mentor corps. Now, I have a day job. I do the Justice for Vets things on weekends and evenings, but occasionally I'll get to go do some mentor training, where we take the training on the road, so to speak. And I will tell you, if you don't train your mentors, they will identify what they believe to be their own tasks and their own mission and their own role. And I would also suggest to you, it's probably not going to be the same role that you need them to perform. But by gosh, they've got a mission, they're going to move out. If you don't give them the guidance and the training, then they're going to define it themselves. So I just urge not only the use of mentors, but of course the importance of training, the importance of vetting. Some methodologies are you just call your local VSO and say, hey, do you know Bob? Bob a good mentor? Oh, Bob's great. Good, that's all we need. Forget that. That's just not going to work. It really is an important part of this process. To me, that's almost one of our greatest vulnerabilities as we continue to get our brand out there, is a mentor gone astray. We can certainly help that, and that is with training, accountability, engagement, observation. But the Ohio study pointed out, and Judge, not to talk about your home state, because I know you will, but the VTCs with mentors experienced, quote, better clinical outcomes, and the veteran mentors and the veterans felt, quote, more socially connected. Please don't downplay my point being the role of mentors and the importance of training. The third observation I'll make to you is whatever process you have, make sure there is a sustained engagement. Judge, you set the standard. This is not as we would describe, fire and forget. This is constant vigilance, constant monitoring, constant engagement by the leadership to ensure that the courts are doing what you need them to do. Next point I'd offer to you is no one size fits all. When I retired about 2.5 years ago, and I was all about, hey, we need model legislation, we need a model court, and we need everybody to fall in line and do exactly what we think we ought to be doing. Then I realized, oh, wait a minute, maybe the states have their own views. Oh, wait a minute, maybe the judges have their own views. And boy, that bright idea lasted about no time at all. But what I would suggest to you is whatever model you have, please adopt a set of standards, whether it's the NADCP standards from 13 and 15, the best practice, whether it's adult drug court standards that have been modified to meet veterans treatment courts, whether it's the 10 key components that Judge Russell in Buffalo identified back as far as 2009. But those standards go back to 97. But whatever, Justice for Vets has its 10 key components. My point being, identify the standards and then ensure you proceed with diligence in making your court operate pursuant to those standards. My next observation is branding. Don't think that everybody knows who we are and loves what we do. And I'll give you a great example. I'm always looking for money, right? If you're not, then raise your hand. I mean, the bottom line is we have to find funding. The more money we have, the more great things we can do. So I talked to a senior partner at a law firm in D.C. the other day who has a position as a director on a major nonprofit. And I started talking about coming out here this weekend, and I said, Veterans Treatment Courts, absolutely a success story. To which he replied, you know what you guys are doing to help veterans file their claims, that's just awesome. I thought, wow, our branding is not what we need it and would like it or think it to be. So be a messenger for these courts, right? Take your time, understand that what they mean is they mean well, but they just don't get us. And we got to ensure our branding is out there. We got to ensure the data exists to aid in our efforts to locate resources. Data not only leads you to resources, but it leads you to best practices. So again, pay attention to the branding piece. Pay attention to whether you're gathering that evaluative information that helps decision makers decide, yeah, this is more than just waving a flag. This is good stuff. One final observation, and that's my effort in Kansas, my home state. Went to law school there, have great relationships and connections to the state, but I'm a Northern Virginian. As bad as that sounds, it actually is worse. So for 2.5 years, beat the pavement in Kansas, trying to get a Veterans Treatment Court started. Even had a meeting with the lieutenant governor, and I thought, well, I'm in. Right? The Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court is a law school classmate. Senator Jerry Moran, law school classmate. Sam Brownback, law school classmate. I thought, how could I not be successful? Go to the meeting with the Lieutenant Governor. I had missed an important piece, and that was the tag, the National Guard tag for the state of Kansas. I'll tell you, if it's a matter involving the military in that state, don't overlook the tag. My effort stopped. It took the courage of one judge, Judge McCarthy in Kansas City, Kansas, to say, sounds all right, I'll do this. And so now they have a Veterans Treatment Court. Don't overlook, lots of steps to go through to socialize your efforts. Don't overlook the tag. So I'm going to wrap up now. This is sort of my whiz-bang conclusion. And it's a little bit soapboxy and it's a little bit emotional, but not as emotional as your story of Mike Hogan in Alaska. Well, I tell you what, if you aren't committed to the cause after that, you'll never be committed. But please remember that our work should always represent hope. When a mom of a veteran takes the stage at our conference in Anaheim and says, quote, he was lost to me and you brought him back, that's hope. That's what we bring. Jack O'Connor's comment in a study that was written in 2009. Jack is, of course, mentor extraordinaire for the Buffalo Treatment Court, who said, you know, somewhere, somehow, someone cared about a veteran's growth and development, and that's us. We represent hope. So thanks for what you do, and thanks for the hope that you bring to others who have pretty much given up on their future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, General Tate.
Sir.
I'm next going to introduce Justice Evelyn Eve Stratton to my left. She and I have something in common as well. She was a trial judge for 7 years. She went on after that to be an Ohio Supreme Court justice for 16 years, and that's where our similarities cease. She retired from the Supreme Court of Ohio early to more fully pursue criminal justice reforms, with a particular emphasis on veterans who become involved with the justice system. She established the Veterans in the Courts Initiative in 2009 and has been active in working with the VA and local court systems to establish veterans treatment courts. And I also understood that she's worked closely with Judge Manley with regard to the formation of the VJO classification. So with that, Justice Stratton.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me out to speak with you. I've been and participated and put on several conferences, and I am such a believer in them because there are so many connections that you make. I have seen people talking and exchanging cards, and I've exchanged cards and ideas, and these things are catalysts. So I'll thank you for your leadership, and I hope you continue to do things like this. A little bit of housekeeping. There are 2 clips right on the corner there. If you would pick those up and pass those around. I do a weekly veterans letter. I have a volunteer that does it. We don't get a dime for it. We don't advertise anything in it. We don't even have any funding for it. But he does it out of the kindness of his heart. He's a retired aeronautical engineer who retired way too early in his board and does some wonderful work. And he's tweeting as we talk. Anyhow, if you are interested in that newsletter, please leave a card or very clearly print your email and we'll add you to it. We sent a lot of information out in California because we have a large readership in California, and I understand there are some people here who came because they saw it in the newsletter. So it's a wonderful source. We have a whole section on TBI, PTSD, veterans courts, suicide, and we added a new section on universities and colleges because they're doing so much with vets and taking leadership. So if you're interested, please do that. I want to kind of start back with a little bit of why. Why do we do a veterans court? Because you'll get that from the media. You'll get that from the public. Why should we treat a criminal who is in the court system any differently? They're a criminal. You hear that a lot. I've heard that a lot. And this is one of the responses I give them. A veteran is somebody who gave a blank check to the government for a period of time, including and up to their life. When you think about that, that is powerful. And to me, that is why we need to treat veterans differently, because they have given something up for us. And sometimes they come back with damage because they gave up something for us. I come from a long line of military, 5 uncles in World War II, my father in World War II, lost my grandfather in World War II, my 2 brothers in the Vietnam era. And I grew up with military because I was a missionary kid growing up in Thailand, went to a boarding school in South Vietnam until the war got too bad, and then the school moved to Malaysia. And the only Americans I knew growing up were my parents and GIs. My mother never let me date them, but alas, I did know them. But I came back, and I eventually ended up came back by myself because my parents were still in Thailand. Worked my way through college, law school, got on the bench, and for the first time figured out there was mental illness. Never saw it growing up, never was exposed to it, never was aware of it. But when I got on the bench, saw it front and center. And this is the choir, so I don't have to tell you about that. So I got very involved in mental health courts and started pushing that locally and pushing that, helped form a group nationally. And so I was in Washington, D.C., giving a speech, decided I was going to not go to the airport early, I was just going to stay and have breakfast one more time, sat next to a guy from the VA named John Kuhn, 2007, I even found my letter to him, and he said, I want to start veterans courts. The VA wants to start veterans courts. And I said, what is that? Thinking it was a court of appeals for benefits, But he said, when he described it, I said, well, that's a mental health court or a drug court with a vet in it. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get a specialized docket? I've been devoting 10 years of my life trying to get specialized dockets, trying to get mental health courts, and it's an uphill battle. Why don't you join our movement? So we had a big conference in D.C. in 2008. We brought all the VA muckety-mucks in, and we had a lot of presenters on who had done mental health courts. And Judge Russell, who had done, at that point, one of the very few mental health or veterans courts. And out of that then came a committee in 2009. And in the 2009, we met in the VA in Washington. Judge Manley was there. Dr. Rosenthal, raise your hand because you were one of the early presenters, was there. And Judge Lindley from here was there, and Judge Russell and a couple others. And we put together this idea of the Veterans Justice Outreach. Actually, they had already come up with the idea. We sort of helped flesh it out. And one of the things we said to them is, please do not limit the VJOs to veterans courts, because some places will never have them. Look at the experience with Kansas. Some places don't believe in them. There's a whole host of things. But anyone who is a veteran that ends up in the criminal justice system ought to be able to call the VJO. That's something that's not always widely known. A lot of people think only the Veterans Court gets the VJO. But the advantage of the Veterans Court is economies of scale. You can't have 20 judges calling the VJO 20 times in 20 different locations. And if you do a Veterans Court, you can have the VJO come with their computer like Judge Russell does, who can identify and set up appointments right in the courtroom. But it's economies of scale. But we try to train our courts in Ohio that anybody who gets a veteran in their system should call the VJO. And often that first relationship, that first time the judge starts using the VJO, develops into a veterans court. So we got that going, and then I got all excited, and I came back to Ohio and all ready to start veterans courts, and found out no judge asked if they were a veteran. And I also learned you can't ask if they're a veteran, you have to ask if they have military background. Women, for a high percentage reason, don't identify as vets. People without combat, lots of reasons. So you have to ask if you have a military background. One of our judges has a sign right in the clerk's office window. If you have military background, please let us know. Right in the clerk's window at the very front where he comes in. So initially, I spent a lot of time trying to get judges interested in veterans courts. It really wasn't very hard. We had a lot of mental health courts by that time. We had about 30, and a lot of the mental health court judges were willing to start them. But we also had a lot of veterans on the bench who were not in the mental health courts or drug court who then took up the mantle. And so after the first initial few, I really didn't have to really do much more to get them going, because they became missionaries to each other and persuaded each other, to the point that we now have 20 veterans courts in Ohio. But again, we try to train all of our judges to look at military background. And in fact, we have a risk assessment system that has a screen that all judges are mandated to use, called the Ohio Risk Assessment System. It has a drop-down screen that has all about vets on it. So if you identify somebody with military background, it drops down. What theater? What were you exposed to? Did you have a TBI? Did you have a PTSD? Did you have Agent Orange exposure? And that's required for the judges. And we also got a statute passed that requires judges to look at their military background in mitigation. So now you have to identify, because you've got to put that factor in your sentencing. So that all went forward. So what have we learned in terms of recidivism? First of all, we have 213 specialized dockets in Ohio. We are really very aggressive on believing all sorts of types. We even have 2 prostitution courts. Did you know the average life expectancy of a prostitute is 35 years of age? You talk about a public health issue. Trafficked, mostly 80% are trafficked when they start as teenagers. So anyhow, we have 2 very successful they call them catch courts. But of the specialized dockets we have, the veterans courts are far and above the most successful. There are a lot of reasons for it. Some of it's the military background. They respond to command. They respond to authority. When they stand up in court, some of your defendants are slouching and, military, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, no, sir. I mean, the demeanor is amazingly different. But they respond to that command of authority. Some of it is when they are in a court setting, they're working with their peer mentors, they're with other veterans, and now all of a sudden they're back in a community. I had one of these veterans explain that, when they came back with just family and no other military around them, they were lost, they were isolated, they missed that sense of camaraderie. Now they're in a veterans court and they're connected again. They've got a community that they can talk to and relate to and associate with too again. There's many diverse reasons, but the reality is they are more successful. Some of them questioned yesterday, are they going to be abject failures or are they going to be total successes? I'm maintaining they're going to be total successes. I just sampled a couple of ours. Youngstown was one of our early, Youngstown is an area that's known for mafia. I've had more cases on the Supreme Court from Youngstown. Let me tell you, it's got a very interesting history. So they've got a tough crowd up there, but they have a municipal level, which is a misdemeanor level. They currently have 9 in it, 9 mentors, 35 graduates, 0 recidivism. Stark County has a felony level, not misdemeanor, felony. Currently have 22, usually have up to 35, 17 mentors, and I'm a firm believer in mentors, absolutely important. 61 graduates. Up until 1 year ago, they'd had no recidivism. And now they've had 5% felony recidivism, 8% misdemeanor out of 61. Hamilton Municipal Court, currently 19 in it, 56 graduates, 7% recidivism. And we did a study, a university did a study recently. We like universities because they often like to do these studies and analyze things. And they followed 86 veterans. Only 9 had been rearrested during the program and 4 after, which was a 10% rearrest level. 21% gained full-time employment during the program. 31% went from living in unstable housing to stable housing. 16% got enrolled in school or training. But here's a factor that I thought was very interesting. The mental health treatment was so successful that while all participants shared the program meeting diagnostic criteria, started the program meeting diagnostic criteria for PTSD, 25% exiting the program did. Their PTSD was dealt with while they were in the program. So I maintain that they are indeed very, very successful. But I want to also make sure that we understand that this is a court. You are in this court because you committed a crime. And sometimes people talk about, well, is it collaborative and is it all feel good and they're in there because they committed a crime. And courts are problem-solving courts. I say to judges who say, I'm not a social worker, I'm not going to do that namby-pamby mental health stuff or veteran stuff. And I said, do you have a probation department? Yeah. Do you ever prescribe drug treatment in your probation department? Well, yeah. you're a problem-solving court. It's just a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree, because what happens in a problem-solving court is that the judge can bring everybody to the table. In your regular court, you say, okay, vet, mental health person, whatever, I want you to go get mental health treatment. You've never been diagnosed. I want you to go get drug and alcohol treatment because they're self-medicating. Go get a house, get a job. Where do they go? Under the bridge, right back to where, and they cycle in and out. In a problem-solving court, and especially in a veterans court, the judge calls the team and they come together. I've given lots of speeches where I said, how is anyone in this room never returned a phone call from a judge? Anyone in this room ever never returned a call? Point taken. The judge can call a meeting. I've called countless statewide meetings and they all come. And the judge in a local community can call a meeting, right, Judge?
Right.
You call your meeting, everybody comes, and all of a sudden you say, okay, we're not going to have silos anymore. And instead of sending them to 4 places, let's talk about what they need first. We have to diagnose them first before we can even figure out what to do. We have to get them a house before they do any treatment. You do it as a team, and what the VJO brings, and what I sell to all my courts is the VJO brings a whole stream of resources that your local community doesn't have. I don't care all the stuff they may say negative about the VA. There is a lot of good. I am very proud of the VA, and I think next time we have a conference, we should have someone from the VA at the table talking about the good things that the VA does as well. Because I went to the initial conferences that Dr. Rosenthal and his team helped set up to train our VJOs. I was the very first one in Dallas, and I sat next to a gentleman who had to translate for me because I had no idea what all these acronyms meant. And I was astounded. You had job training programs and drug training programs and housing programs and employment programs, and it went on. And you never hear about all those things, but accessing was the issue. And all of a sudden your VGO is your access right straight to that program. And I tell my judges who don't want to, well, I'm not going to do a better, listen, if you don't use the VGO, you are leaving all those resources on the table that your community could access. And every time you get a veteran accessing the VA services, you free up very scarce local dollars for somebody else in your system. And so I sell it on the financial terms, I sell it on emotional terms, I sell whatever terms I can sell it on, I use those terms because there are so many ways that it can benefit somebody. How do you get the leadership to do this? You could do it top down and you can bottom up. And it happens both ways. Bottom up are the judges, like the judges in this room, who get in there and say, I'm going to start one. Like the judge of Vice said, I'm going to start one. I don't care what anybody else says, I'm going to start one. But also, if you can get top leadership to engage, what I found in Ohio, our Chief Justice, Justice Moyer, was a very big believer in drug courts. And so he really pushed starting drug courts. I came along and I was a believer in mental health courts, and I started pushing them. And what judges said to me repeatedly was, because you took the leadership, you gave us permission to do what we did. I suggest you go to your leadership. Go to a justice on your bench. I've had so many judges do something simply because somebody asked. Somebody went to them and said, they asked, they said, we ought to start looking at a mental health court. They went and asked. Go to your chief justice in your community and say, this is something that's a growing movement. Here's the data. Here's how beneficial. Here's all the resources, all the things we're talking about, all the things you're looking at. Say, will you be willing to take some leadership in this? If you're in a state that's elected, it's very good for re-election because it's a very big issue. So you could sell it on that if you have to. But if you get a justice involved, now your local judge can call a meeting and everybody comes. Guess what happens when the justice calls a meeting? Everybody comes. And now the justice can pull people together and say, let's work on this as a state. So I urge you to not ignore your top level leadership in your judiciary, but to go to them and say, we want you to take ownership of this and do something about it. So there's a couple ways you can tackle it on that. So I'm a big believer in it. I think that it is so important, and I hope that you're circulating that document around. So if you want to get on the email list, you can, because it's a way to connect. You're free to give us articles for the newsletter. We don't sell things for you. We don't fundraise for you. We try to be very careful to stay very neutral, but it's a way to help you connect and make these connections that you have today continue afterwards. So again, thank you for your leadership. If you continue to develop your programs, we'll continue to advertise them in our newsletter, and hopefully all of these connections will continue to grow. Thanks.
Thanks, Judge.
Thank you, Justice Stratton. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Brooks Holliday. in keeping with our theme here, she and I have something in common as well. We both have advanced degrees, and we both work in the mental health field. The only difference is she's the only one qualified to do it. She is an associate behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. Her research has focused on forensic psychology, criminal justice, juvenile justice, justice-involved veterans, and issues related to veteran post-deployment health. Dr. Brooks Holliday completed her pre-doctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center, where she specialized in neuropsychology and contributed to research related to Gulf War veterans, complementary and integrative health, sleep disturbances, and pain. Doc Holliday.
Thank you. I feel kind of sorry for you all that I'm the one closing out the official speakers on this panel, especially after hearing such great information from people who have actually been there on the ground in the development and the implementation of these VTCs. And now you're hearing from me as kind of the more academic perspective, which is a little bit dry of a way to end things. But hopefully I will bring somewhat unique of a perspective. I am a clinical psychologist by training, and my work has really spanned both the criminal justice and veteran mental health system. And so I approach the idea of conceptualizing the measurement of effectiveness from both of those pieces of my background. So before we start, I want to talk about the framework that I use for discussing effectiveness research. And this is really generally speaking to the criminal justice system. This is not necessarily specific to veterans. In a moment, I'm going to talk about what this might mean as applied to veterans. But this is a framework that I use for conceptualizing effectiveness research across criminal justice treatment settings. And this framework is called risk-need responsivity. So really, this is designed as a model of effective correctional intervention, and it's predicated on 3 principles. Oh, sure. Thank you. So the first is the risk principle, and I first have to stop here and thank Judge Ross for introducing the concept of a risk needs assessment instrument, because that's going to be something that plays in to what I'm talking about here. But the risk principle suggests that if we're providing effective interventions to individuals involved in the justice system, that a person's level of risk should inform the intensity of the services they receive, such that higher risk people, and when I say risk, I'm talking about risk of recidivism, receive more intensive services. And you could think about this as duration of services, you could think about frequency of services. There are a lot of different ways to measure intensity. The second principle is the need principle. And this states that what we should do when providing interventions is target a specific offender's dynamic risk factors. So I'm going to step aside from the slide for a second to explain what exactly a dynamic risk factor is. We've heard this concept of risk needs assessment, and when a psychologist like myself is working in the criminal justice system, we think about the factors that are increasing the likelihood that someone is going to commit a crime again in the future. And the reality of it is, most of the factors that we know to be associated with future criminal activity are dynamic. They have the potential to change, and even more importantly, they have the potential to change in response to intervention. So if I'm thinking about general recidivism among general offenders, really the only static risk factor is past criminal history. But when we start thinking about things like substance use or education and employment or antisocial attitudes, those are all things that have the potential to change. And so if we are offering effective interventions, we should be looking at a given individual, figuring out what his or her dynamic risk factors are, or criminogenic needs, and then intentionally assigning them to services that will target those factors. This really kind of bucks against what happens a lot of times, I think, in correctional settings, which are these one-size-fits-all treatment, where offenders go to big lectures where they're supposed to be learning these general principles, or everyone gets streamlined into the same treatment track. This really moves away from that and talks about the importance of individualizing the treatment that someone's receiving. Then finally, we have the responsivity principle. So this actually has 2 prongs, the first of which is general responsivity, which says that when we're providing interventions to justice-involved individuals, the most effective interventions are cognitive behavioral or social learning in their orientation, which are psychology terms, not really what I'm most concerned about right now. What I'm more concerned about is specific responsivity. which says that when we're providing interventions, we should be trying to tailor the delivery of the intervention to a person's individual characteristics. So these aren't necessarily things that are related to risk of recidivism, but they're the types of ways we can shape an intervention to be better met or better received by the person who, to whom we're trying to provide the intervention. A good example of this is if you're working with someone who has maybe low verbal abilities, you're not going to want to overload them with written information, with worksheet-heavy interventions, which often happen in psychology. You're going to want to be responsive to that. If I'm thinking about how that applies to working with justice-involved veterans, then it's thinking about ways that we can consider the types of military history, military training a person has been through, and how you might be able to be responsive to that or potentially leverage that when you're providing an intervention. So this is the framework that really guides my thinking about effectiveness research in the criminal justice system in general. And I do think that it has applicability when working with veterans who are justice involved as well. And I'm not the only person who has thought this. There are other researchers, including some great researchers affiliated with the Palo Alto VA, who have been doing some thought work on this as well. But there are some challenges that we run into. One of the biggest challenges is that, as was mentioned, ideally, when you're running a court, you're going to begin with a risk assessment so you can figure out exactly what someone's individual criminogenic needs and risk factors are. And the issue is that, especially from a psychological perspective, you want to make sure you're choosing an instrument that has been validated for use with a particular population. So you don't necessarily want to take a measure that was validated only on men and assume that it's going to work in the same way for women. And the same is true for taking a measure that was developed for use with general offenders and assuming that it applies for veteran offenders. So it's a real challenge. There are some workarounds. You can at least use these general risk assessment instruments to get an initial idea of where someone falls on these different factors. There also has been more progress related to assessing violence risk than there has been related to assessing risk of general offending. My colleagues have been involved in some great work related to violence and sexual violence risk. But there's a real gap here. And the problem is, if we don't know what someone's risk level is, it makes it really hard to be intentional about that process of assigning the appropriate intensity of services. Now, regarding criminogenic needs, there are kind of two factors that come into play when applying this to veterans. First is, do veterans share many of the same criminogenic risk factors or needs that non-veterans have? And also, are there veteran-specific criminogenic needs? And I think these are both important questions. There has been some research that suggests that there are similarities between the risk factors for non-veteran populations and for veteran populations. Things like substance use play a really important role. But there's been not that much research into this area to begin with, and some of the research on these other risk factors has been a little bit more mixed. So what role do antisocial peers play in the process, spending time around other people who are involved in criminal activity? What role do education and employment play? There's just not a lot of research to guide our thinking on this. There's also some suggestion that there are veteran-specific criminogenic needs, and one of the things that's come up over and over again in this conference is the role of PTSD, and I know there's also a lot of concern about the role of TBI. So if we're thinking about a general offender population, mental health concerns actually aren't considered a criminogenic need because the evidence that mental health factors are directly tied to recidivism is not quite there, which isn't to suggest that mental health can't influence someone's pathway into the criminal justice system. There's been some research that people with mental health concerns end up finding themselves with the same risk factors as the general offender population, but their pathway towards obtaining those risk factors has been kind of streamlined by their mental health factors. But when you're looking at providing an intervention, you're going to be looking at some of the same targets. This might be different for veterans, though. There is some evidence, and especially when it comes to things like violence risk, that PTSD could play a role. And even in general offending, there's some evidence that PTSD, and particularly PTSD with high levels of anger or irritability, are also associated with criminal activity. And so really we have to think about, are we meeting some of those general criminogenic needs with the interventions that we're providing, and also are we targeting some of those veteran-specific needs? So that's just a little bit of an introduction to how I've gone about thinking about the types of measures that you might want to collect or might want to consider when trying to measure the effectiveness of these VTCs. And I've divided these into process measures, things that you might be collecting or considering as to what's happening while the person is involved with the court, as well as more outcome-related measures that you might be measuring after a person completes treatment and has graduated. So I first want to put a plug in that even diversion from the traditional criminal justice system is an important metric. So some of the information on this slide comes from research related to other problem-solving courts, and some is specific to veterans courts. But we know that the cost of providing treatment for mental health issues in jails and prisons is substantial. And we know that the services that are available can be quite limited. And so when you're able to funnel someone into a VTC, it opens up a lot of treatment options and also the potential for cost savings in treatment, especially if you're leveraging partnerships with places like the VA or other community-based services. Some of these items were also touched on with the talks yesterday and earlier today, that you end up with judges and staff who are familiar with the unique needs of the population and who are aware of the appropriate resources. You can leverage the strengths and assets of military veterans, and Justice Stratton touched on some of the ways that this happens, both the level of command for authority, the community of veterans and how that plays out in the court setting, as well as the use of mentors. And even more importantly, just ensuring that veterans are not falling through the cracks for all the reasons that have been identified. This is a population that deserves our attention and deserves to be caught so that they're not finding their way lost in the system. I also think that we need to not just be thinking about what happens as a result of receiving services through these courts, but we need to be thinking about whether or not the veterans are actually getting the services that they most need. And those are related both to criminal justice factors and mental health related factors. So if someone's biggest risk factor is substance use, it kind of spans both of these areas. We need to be making sure that someone is getting those treatments. If someone is having, if someone's big deficit is education or employment, then we need to be making sure that we're finding ways to get them hooked up with services, with training programs, with educational programs. And even more than that, it's not just connecting someone with a service, but it's making sure that people get those services at the needed dosage. So there is some evidence to suggest that this idea of sufficient dosage of treatment does apply in problem-solving courts. So there's been work that's been done in the drug court setting that suggests that people really need somewhere between 6 and 12 months of treatment to really gain benefits from it. And so I think we need to look at whether or not only people are being funneled into treatment, but also are they receiving enough treatment. I'm going to skip the next slide just because it's a little esoteric for a Saturday morning, and move on to talking about outcomes. So this really is the big question. How do we then look at outcomes? Because anecdotally speaking, we can say that we're seeing great things happening, and there's some preliminary data to suggest that these types of courts really are effective. But policymakers and funders like to see data. So there are, of course, the criminal justice outcomes that we need to be looking at. The point was made yesterday that recidivism is something that can be defined in a whole diversity of ways. It's something like violation of court terms or violation of probation. It could be rearrest. It could be reconviction. It could be reincarceration. So there are a lot of metrics out there. Even when you look at the general criminal justice literature, the metrics that are used are all over the place, which makes it difficult to compare across programs. It's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges to bananas. And so I think that, especially with some of these grassroots efforts, the selection of the specific outcome isn't necessarily the most important, so much as you're thinking about, for our court, what makes sense as a measure or an indicator of recidivism. And I think that sometimes, especially in the research literature, what gets missed is this idea of participation in criminal activities or problematic behaviors that doesn't end up getting detected through official channels. And I think, again, Judge Ross made a really good point about this. We can go to the publicly available records and see whether or not someone has been rearrested, but that doesn't tell us what's happening in the life of the person who is not necessarily interfacing with the criminal justice system again. So I love the idea of finding a way to more intentionally follow up with the individual to figure out how those things are going. And of course, we can't ignore the mental health outcomes. There's PTSD. There are the other mental health symptoms and conditions. And not just the symptoms that we might think of, but especially things like irritability, anger, those symptoms that we know might be predisposing people to end up back in the criminal justice system. I also think about more behavioral symptoms. I think that TBI is one of the most difficult things to talk about when it comes to treatment courts and treatment of justice-involved veterans in general, because we just don't know that much about really good treatments for TBI the way we do for PTSD. PTSD, there are all these great evidence-based treatments that have been rolled out through the VA and through the community. We don't necessarily have comparable treatment packages that are being disseminated for TBI, but there are absolutely concerns like impulsivity or disinhibition. And of course, substance use. I read a stat that 60% of veterans who are involved in the criminal justice system have a substance use disorder. 75% of those have a co-occurring substance use and mental health disorder. These are really big scope problems. And then finally, just one little plug. So cost effectiveness, again, I mentioned previously that problem-solving courts might be a way to save money. Leveraging community-based and VA-based options can provide cost savings. I don't necessarily think that this is the outcome we should be focusing on the most, and there are a lot of times that I think that there are interventions that might be less cost-effective but are more effective from a human perspective. But I put this up there just because it can be a very persuasive argument to policymakers. So to the extent that we can try to operationalize cost-effectiveness, it could have some benefits. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Dr. Holliday. Are there any questions or observations anyone would like to make at this point? Sir, are the microphones working?
Couple of questions to the evaluation suggestions and the outcomes and process measures. If we're going to tell VTCs, as I think we all agree we should, that stronger, better evaluation, deeper evaluation to tell the story in quantitative terms, the response that the judge asked for, we may owe them a clearer message on what that costs. We get asked the question, and I'm sure others do as well, who work with VTCs and other collaborative courts, what's good evaluation cost? And there isn't an off-the-shelf easy answer to that, but there is a conversation about if you don't set aside 10% or 20% or more to do serious evaluation, you're just counting heads as they come through and relying upon the justice system and the other systems that you talk to send you data that they usually don't have or won't send. So I think my plea is for us to dig a little deeper in answering that question. Our answer as a shop that does some evaluation is to say, if you aren't willing to set aside 20%, you don't have a solid story to tell. But when you say that, you're saying to somebody who just got a $200,000 grant that they really got a $160,000 grant, and that they have to develop working relationships inside the staff to work with an outside evaluator or build inside capacity they don't have in a way that's going to be very expensive. You're right to underscore how expensive first-rate treatment is. Decent, not yet first-rate, not gold standard control groups, randomized control. Decent evaluation is also expensive. I think we owe some clarity about that. Second point, in talking about substance abuse treatment, I think we got to be honest, if that's one of the ingredients we're going to measure, that the three different ways that gets funded each have their own separate silo way of measuring outcomes. The VA outcomes for substance abuse treatment and SAMHSA, the piece of the federal government that runs the block grant, and Medicaid, the piece of the federal government that is expanding treatment funding more than we've ever had before, all three of those have different outcome systems. So until the federal government begins to get its act together, we've got, you may do a great job of blending those three kinds of funding. Good luck, you've got three different sets of books to keep if you're in good faith trying to have good evaluation. That's not a VTC's fault. That's not the state's fault. That's not the county's fault. That's not the judicial system's fault. The federal government hasn't gotten its act together. Unfortunately, the GAO study touched on that just in passing. Could have said much more about that. And the likelihood that the VA, we have a wide range of opinions, I think, here about the VA, ranging from acknowledging how difficult their job is and how well they've done that with the resources they've got, to a belief some of us have that the VA is much like the post office in 1980, waiting for faster, better, more results accountable providers to come along and do the job better. Now, within that range of opinions on the VA, we can ask the VA to do a better job with this and to get with the other federal agencies that fund treatment and decide whether there's a common way of measuring it. Because if there isn't, then we're stuck with three silos, and you can't ask counties or states or judicial systems to get their act together in measuring effectiveness. I think we have to name that problem as one of the big barriers to better, decent evaluation.
Please, Justice.
I'd like to mention one resource, though, that we use heavily in Ohio. Universities and colleges. They all have PhDs and professors and people that need research projects and need to publish, and we have so effectively utilized our universities and said, come in and do a study. Will you come in and help us set up the metrics, because you know how to do studies, and we don't. That's not our specialty. We're judges. So they can come in, help you figure out how to do your studies. They can do a doctorate on your studies. They can have students that work on studies. Am I right? That you can really, so I really urge you to look at your local university, your state university, whatever, and maybe you can make a real leadership position in that you set up studies of your courts. And that can make a huge difference when you don't have those resources, you don't have that 20%. Utilize your universities and colleges to bring them in to do those studies and help. And then eventually maybe there's some metrics that can come out of that. There's some standards that come out of that you could take to the feds and say, here's a good way of measuring it. So that's a suggestion.
And John, now I know how you can repay me for moderating here. we'll be talking. Ma'am.
My name is Sherilyn D'Amigo. I have served on the board with the National Board with Blue Star Mothers of America, and I'm currently sitting on the Veterans Committee for West Care Foundation, which provides social services to, I don't even know how many states and provinces. But the idea I want to try to touch on, I heard both Justice Stratton and Major Tate mention this idea of fairness for our veterans. Coddling. Are we coddling them? Are we, by providing special courts, are we providing something that we aren't providing to the rest of the general public or the services? And I come from an education background, and one of the things that we've had to address in education, especially in the elementary school level and even up through middle school and high schooler, is the idea that kids have of this sense of fairness. You know, that's not fair. I can't tell you as a first grade teacher how many times I heard that on the playground. You know, sometimes daily or, you know, repeatedly. That's not fair. That's not fair. You know, as a middle school science teacher, I would get, you know, why did you give him this assignment and me this assignment? That's not fair. And we really I had to in my classroom work on educating students on what fairness was. If one student can't read and the other student is reading at a college level, the same assignment is not fair to either one of them. And the idea of fairness really comes into definition as what each child needs. If I'm meeting your needs, then that's what's fair for you. So if we relate this to veterans courts and we come to the idea, I tell you a story, I say that, you know, there's a 20-year-old kid that just held up a cab driver at gunpoint. And he's being charged with armed robbery and now a 10-year gun enhancement for California for the use of a firearm. We'd all say, whoa, send that kid to prison. 12 to 15 years is well-deserved. If we add in the criteria that he was a veteran on a month less than a month home from his second tour of Iraq, it was on the anniversary of the KIA date of his best friend that on his first tour he had seen within a 2-week period 3 of his best friends killed, that he had no previous history of any criminal activity. He had a perfect Marine Corps record, that he was carrying the firearm because he was heading to the park to commit suicide so that he didn't leave a mess for his brother in the apartment that they shared. The criteria for fairness changes, and that event occurred prior to most of the veterans courts that were set up. And under the criteria of many of the veterans courts, he would not have been serviced. That was my son. He did serve 85% of a 6-year sentence. He's home. He was actually just released from parole a year early because he had 0 parole offenses or violations. He's going to college. He's doing well. He's stable. A veterans court would have been a great alternative for him. And so I've kept my ear to the ground and stayed in touch with what's happening with veterans courts nationwide, because it's so important for our men and women who have given so much for our country, that the fairness factor and what they need and the effectiveness of what we're doing is important. And I just want to just kind of lend that personal touch to the idea of it is worth what we're doing. It is worth, the effectiveness is there. We're seeing the results. We need to find better ways to measure it and to report it and to spread the word that this is available, and to make the opportunities available for other veterans. But I just want to say thank you, and to all of you who are actively involved in this pursuit, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. Sir.
Yes. I live in San Francisco County and I'm very proud to have our judge here representing us. I also go to the VA Palo Alto here, just around the corner from us. I think I'm going to piggyback on the same theme, fair. I think that's what I was trying to get, is that I really believe in these veterans treatment courts, but partnering with the Veterans Administration is not fair for us veterans. And clinicians like yourself might defend that because you did your internship, but let me explain. Most of the time, I am 100% service-connected, PTSD, and in the Marines, and I don't need to brag. But in the VA, you have to tell your war story. You have to tell you are a Navy SEAL. You have to tell your combat, your how many tours. And some of us personally, we don't want to hear that because some other veterans have other like military sexual trauma. And that's not discussed publicly in open forum, how some veterans are treated lesser. VA employees do that excessively a lot. They want us to tell the war stories, and you get priority services. And I was thinking about Justice Evelyn Stratton, how you were talking about in Ohio, how your courts are now asking, where did you serve? What did you do? And that kind of now, and you mentioned something about women, how women can female veterans do not like to be, I go to the vet centers, the combat vet centers, not to the VA hospitals. But in the combat vet centers, they tell us, you don't have to be re-traumatized, you don't have to disclose. But it's almost like, we're poster childs. Oh, this West Point, this Navy SEAL, And so we're just like, well, I don't care anymore. I'm done. And I sometimes want people in the audience to know that, I don't see MST different from someone who's got SEAL training. They both got PTSD. So I think there's the sexes. I think almost I see there's almost like in the veterans community, male veterans, it's an old boys network. they brag. You go to treatment substance abuse center, you hear the war stories. And just to give you facts, the VA Palo Alto Women's PTS treatment has only 10 beds. So for the judges, that Judge Manley is not here present, but when the male veterans are like in a priority, they got to get, we can't remand them to jail. There's that bed waiting. There's 90 beds at the VA hospital for males. So there is disservices. There's no fair system, and it's here in Palo Alto, in our own backyard, where we have VA employees sitting here telling us it's the crown jewel. You know, they're probably going to hear and say, I'm scratching myself, gee, that's how fair is that? And so there are injustices in there that's not fair. And so I myself, you know, I have not committed any crimes. You know, I'm PTSD, and they prioritize this priority one to get services first. But, you know, I support veterans courts, but my fellow veteran who's committed some crime, he gets first priority before I do. And I'm just saying, hey, you know, maybe I should go commit a crime. Maybe I should go break into. So that's what the VA hospitals are doing. It's a hidden culture that I just like saying, gee. And so for me, they're now sending me to Salt Lake City in June 7th. But I've been waiting for almost a year. But the guy who's sitting in jail, in county jails, the courts, and I say this politely, you know, but I just turned the VGOs, they're working fast to put them in, fast track them, versus us who want to have careers in law, go to law school, who want to go to get a career, who are using their GI Bill. And so it seems like we're competing for limited services. So I just don't think it's fair in some way. In some way, I think they should pay. There should be I think, personally, they should perhaps sit there for 30 days and let them think about what they did. The VA should not expedite them first over us. So, and also, there is a VHA. I critique the Veterans Administration Office because it does fail me for the past 10 years. And medical marijuana, you know, VA hospitals here in California, they don't welcome that, but here, many veterans, there is a national policy, BHA Directive 2011-004, that they already wrote a policy that we can use. So the VA can actually disqualify us from any veteran that's in the court, say, well, you're using medical marijuana. So they do discriminate against us. So I expose the other dark side of the VA. I'm not here to, I thank you for taking consideration, but listening to veterans, supporting veterans, but the Navy SEAL versus the poor female who was sexually assaulted in the military, those, you know, they're more hidden to conceal that. And I think that's where female veterans are not feeling comfortable to go. And the enrollment of female veterans is not there in the VA hospitals. So domestic violence, that's perhaps why female veterans are clashing with that. Say, these guys are getting a free ticket because they were sexually assaulted in the military. And now they're seeing the same behavior outside. So anyways, just food for thought. Please take in consideration that. Yeah, I think.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Jude Litzenberger, California Veterans Legal Task Force. I'm concerned more and more as I see veterans courts standing up with gatekeepers that keep out violence, gun crimes, those sorts of things. My experience in San Diego is that those folks who most recently come from combat are committing those kind of crimes. They're getting DUIs, they're having domestic violence offenses, but those are the cases that are getting into veterans courts. What are we doing? Judge Ross, I was really happy to hear that you let in more violent crimes. Are we doing any measurement specifically of veterans courts that do let these kinds of crimes in, and how how the outcomes are, because that's going to be persuasive to those DAs who are gatekeeping now to keep them out. And what can we do to assist that effort? Secondarily, we do talk to universities about volunteering their services for the various evaluation processes we have. What the problem we're having is their IRB system is so bogged down, and they're feeling that they are required to do all these disclosures and basically talk veterans out of participating in any kind of measurements. And that makes it very difficult for us to measure anything other than those numbers that you talked about early on. So I wondered, if you have any thoughts about those things. Thank you very much.
I can address the first one, not the second one, but we have about a third of ours are felony level courts. And felony levels mean you did a much more serious crime. And sometimes in the misdemeanor levels, you can do diversion, but at the felony level, you sometimes have to take a plea, and then you can put them into the same program, but you have to have a plea. And so you may have a conviction, which you try to avoid where you can, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes the crime is so serious you can't. But the outcomes at the felony level are just as successful at the misdemeanor level. And we encourage all of our courts to be as broad as you can. It doesn't matter if you're honorably discharged, dishonorably discharged. You just have to use local resources versus VA resources. But we urge a broad net. But the outcomes at the felony level with the serious crimes are still as positive as the misdemeanors.
Anyone else?
Yeah, speaking to your second point, just about some of the regulatory red tape that happens with research, that is one of the biggest challenges to doing any research in the criminal justice system, and especially when you're thinking about these potentially extra vulnerable subsets. It is intended for the protection of the human subject, so there is a good reason for all of that regulatory red tape, but it can make it challenging. So I think that there are a lot of ways to think about measuring effectiveness. I think one is to partner with a research institution, whether it's a university or a standalone institution, to kind of build that evaluation piece in from the get-go. Even if you're not at the stage where you're ready to take a look at what your measures of effectiveness are, I think there's something really valuable about even just starting to look at what the data systems are, so you can be tracking what's happening within the court. That's really kind of like the stage one. But it is just kind of a reality of the research system that's hard to, there's not really a good way around it.
Thank you. Sir.
Brian Ergunen, UC Santa Cruz and Marine Corps vet. First off, just one comment. On the research piece, we are here to help. UC Santa Cruz isn't Stanford, but we are here to help. And as far as getting in, use your vet centers. Just about every college I know locally, and it is more of a national movement, has a vet center. We can't deal with some of the structural issues, but we can try to kick down doors for you or get in one way or the other. So reach out to us. My question would be, particularly for Dr. Holliday and the two panelists who served, but Justice Stratton, if you have input. What do we know about the veterans who encounter the justice system versus the veterans and service members who don't? And what can we learn from that as far as preventing them from getting to you guys?
That's a great question.
Do you want to take a stab at answering that, Doctor?
Yeah, I think we need to learn a lot more about the differences between those two groups. It's interesting. I have been working on a study myself that's looking, just using some of the publicly accessible data from from substance use treatment centers. So it was mentioned that there's these data elements that the federal government tries to collect, and so some of that is available to the public. So I've been using it to look at, for veterans who are engaged in substance use services, what is the difference between those who were referred through the criminal justice system and veterans who were not referred through the criminal justice system? And also, how do they compare to non-veteran peers who were referred through the criminal justice system? What is the right point of comparison? Is it other veterans? Is it other folks in the criminal justice system? Those analyses suggested that actually there are a lot of similarities between the vets and the non-vets who entered substance use treatment through the criminal justice system. Their histories of use, mental health problems, homelessness, employment look very similar. And the veterans who get involved in the criminal justice system have some dissimilarities from their other veteran peers in that way. So I think that that does have the potential to inform prevention. Like, what are the areas that we need to be targeting? Is it things like homelessness? Is it things like lack of stable employment? Are there psychosocial services that we can inject to those people so that we're bolstering these protective elements to keep them from getting to that spot? But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to flesh out those elements.
And I would say that we do a lot of good for the vets that have to go through the criminal justice system. But these same things, as the doctor was saying, can be equally valuable to those who aren't going through the criminal justice system. And it's just that we don't see them. And lots of times the VA doesn't see them. Even vet centers don't see them because they don't seek help. They don't want to have anything to do with the VA or their prior military life. The advantage we have in the criminal justice system is that we can leverage their participation so that they do get the treatment, so that they do agree to go and speak to, at least to mentors, if not vet centers, if not the VA. But those people don't come before us, at least from a judge's perspective. But I do agree that the lessons that we're learning in the treatment court are going to be very valuable to others. I think the big trick is getting people to come in and seek the help or seek the mentorship. And we can do that in this setting, but we can't do that generally in the abstract, at least not as judges. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for all your diverse input.
Sir.
Good morning. I'm the former Chief Legal Officer of the Special Court Martial Convening Authority at Fort Ord, California, as Vietnam was winding down from 73 to 75. And I know that you count what's important and you don't count what's not important. And so when you establish your priorities, I urge you to consider the people who aren't here today. Because the people who aren't here today are the true well, I shouldn't say that. We've had one speaker who is a true first responder. When I came back from my service overseas, I went home to see Mom. I went home to talk to my father, who was a veteran of World War II, who told me, don't go to the VA. People who go there don't always come back alive. I had a grandfather who served with General Pershing in World War I. We didn't talk about things to our loved ones. That was a matter considered family honor to fulfill. The people who are the true first responders, and I thank Mr. Gardner for pointing that out several times, are the family members, much like yourself, Your Honor. You're a family member and you saw your children come back into your family. If we're going to keep people, if we're really going to keep people close to us and serve us, we need to engage the family members who detect the behavioral problems long before the criminal justice system gets involved. Because by the time I saw Vietnam returnees coming back through civilian control in the Monterey County Jail at the rate of 2,000 plus a month, things were pretty far down the road, and it was darn tough to deal with if I wouldn't have had the support of Colonel Maurice M. Lane, who gave me the order to provide a soldier, every soldier returning to military control, with the opportunity for an honorable discharge. Things have changed, and things have remained the same. The thing that has remained the same is that if you're situationally aware, you realize that we're going through the same drawdown process now that we went through then. And the issue is, are we going to meet that challenge? The thing that's changed is that while I served both in the draft Army and the volunteer Army, we apparently have a deterioration in the kinds of standards that Colonel Lane established for me, which was quite an eye-opener. I was an infantry officer. I was used to putting people in the stockade. And it was quite instructive to learn that there were good reasons for going AWOL, and there were good reasons for misbehavior. And it was my responsibility to motivate people to change that behavior. I urge you to start counting the number of families that are impacted by returning veterans, and reach out to organizations like the Blue Star Mothers and get them involved long before the criminal justice system has to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me one second. Excuse me one second, ma'am.
In Ohio, we have our Ohio National Guard, because we have a large deployment from Ohio that goes to Afghanistan and Iraq. It has a program called Ohio Cares, and it is a sort of a stand-down program that works with families to teach them how their person returning is going to be different. And they have now expanded that program to employers, because the behaviors the family sees, their returning employers also see, and so they've expanded that. That's a great resource. If you don't have that, or you haven't utilized that with your families, urge them to tap their Ohio National Guard or their local National Guard, because it's been a very effective program dealing with training families how to deal with all the changes and watching for those symptoms and that. So I just offered that as a solution.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Good morning. My name is Socorro Gonzalez. I'm an attorney with the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office. I do work in Judge Manley's Veterans Court and in his mental health court. I'm also part of Justice for Vets. I'm part of their faculty over at NDCI, so I've been part of the training of different jurisdictions. One of the things that we deal with as criminal defense attorneys are pretty much all the issues that everybody's talking about. Recidivism rates, how families are impacted. Before a case ever gets into Veterans Treatment Court, it's our job as criminal defense attorneys to present to the court, the judge that's actually has that attempted murder case, the judge that has that assault with a deadly weapon. It's our job to convince the judge to not incarcerate the individual at sentencing, but to consider alternatives such as Veterans Treatment Court. So we have to bring in all that information, reaching out to the family, reaching out to the VA to try to accumulate as much information to present the veteran as an individual and explain the reasons why this individual engaged in the type of conduct that they're being charged with. And oftentimes when we're talking about recidivism rates, I mean, we have different people who come before us, who come to us. For example, we have Vietnam veterans who probably were never connected with services until Veterans Treatment Court. And yeah, they do have a long rap sheet. Then we have our young OEF veteran who probably doesn't have anything, but is now, lo and behold, charged with an attempted murder. So we have two different individuals who would be considered both high risk because of the type of rap sheet they have and because of the crime that they're charged with. But each person should be treated differently, and that's our job as criminal defense attorneys to present the social history and explanation. And working with clinical psychologists or psychiatrists who are familiar with military trauma to help us conduct an assessment to present that to the court as part of our presentation at sentencing. So I think everybody working together, I think creates good results. I have seen with all the veterans who I've represented so far, you know, getting from point A to point B being Veterans Treatment Court, that there's a lot of work that's involved in that. And there, you know, not very many, we're working towards getting more defense attorneys familiarized with military issues. For example, you know, we're not, I'm not a veteran. I've never served in the military, but I became very interested, especially with this movement, to help, you know, help our new veterans, especially who are coming back with these serious charges. So it requires a lot of research because there's a lot involved that we have to go through. For example, especially when we have really serious cases, when they're going to have to look at bloody pictures, you know, of a dead body or, you know, person with a gunshot wound. We don't want to re-traumatize them. So we have to be sensitive to that and knowledgeable that they may not want to look at that picture right now, but we have to get ready for a preliminary hearing, which is scheduled in a few months. So those are the things that we have to familiarize ourselves with, and a lot of the information that's being presented here is really relevant to the practice, to our practice. And I'm really grateful for a lot of the work that you're doing. I think it's great, and it helps us help our veterans.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one last, please.
Hello, my name is Rabia Belt, and I'm at Stanford Law School. And my question is how, following up with the veteran that spoke before, how gender is treated along a number of metrics. One is in terms of how PTSD is manifested with self-harming behavior, more typically in women versus harming other people, more typically in men. I could see that if there are interventions that are being done, the men will look more cost-effective in terms of intervention because of the type of crimes that they're going to be charged with versus the women that may be harming themselves through substance abuse or other types of depressive type behaviors. Also, if a lot of that violence, the interpersonal violence, is targeted towards women. So I wonder if there's any type of intervention or support towards the women that are going to be, that are possibly the victims of veterans who have PTSD that are exhibiting violent behavior. And I guess finally, the last question is, in terms of the type of behavior that could cause the PTSD in the first place. We know that sexual violence is something that is not disclosed as much, but it's also treated very differently than the type of PTSD that could be caused by, say, a gunshot wound or trauma because a friend died in the military or things like that. So if you have, say, a woman who does not want to talk about being raped by a fellow service member, but then is exhibiting PTSD symptoms, how do you deal with that in the court versus another person who may be more likely, or who's a man that's more likely to disclose the type of behaviors or sort of experiences that cause the PTSD in the first place?
Okay.
You got the experience.
Well, we certainly do have in my court some female veterans who have been through military sexual trauma, and they too talk, to the extent that they're comfortable with it, to their treatment providers. To the extent that they don't want to, that's not something that we insist upon in our Veterans Treatment Court by any means. So, but on the other hand, I'm not there in the treatment room, so I don't know to what extent there is that conversation that is required. How much is there? How much is a treatment provider getting the person to talk about it therapeutically or otherwise? As I said, this is not my area of qualification. But I can tell you that we certainly don't insist in my setting in people talking about their issue if they don't wish to. And I hope that the treatment providers are sensitive to that and are trained not to push in that regard. But I can't tell you what goes on there.
I'll just offer a tangential matter, and that is it highlights the importance as we solicit and develop our national mentor corps to take into consideration everything you were saying, and mentors are not just male veterans. And that said, it takes a little additional outreach to solicit participation by female veterans. But by gosh, that's another one of those areas of risk that we have to develop mitigation strategies to address. And we're so comfortable saying, well, there's no female veterans who want to be mentors. Well, is that the truth, or is that just an answer? So while I surely can't answer your question very helpfully, I think it illustrates for all of us that's a risk area that we must mitigate.
And I can tell you that we do have in our court female mentors who do assist the female vets. So thank you very much for your point.
Thank you.
And I think that concludes our panel. Thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you.